Marissa, you are muted.
Yes, I am. Are we ready to go or?
Yeah, showtime.
All right, well, let's go ahead and get started. So first and foremost, I want to thank everyone who is joining us. I am Marissa Tucker. I'm going to be your moderator today, and I come from the YIMBY Democrats of San Diego County. We're a fairly unique organization, and we are the first, and I still believe the only Democratic and partisan YIMBY group. And the reason we do that is because we think building housing is a progressive thing to do. And so we want to make sure that the Democrats also agree with that, and we're pulling them left with us. So that is the main goal of our organization. And so today, I just want to go ahead and jump in. So today you are at the event Redlining and the Legacy of Housing Segregation. So America's history of racially segregated housing continues to leave its mark throughout communities. But there's a lot that we can do to actually bring this dark history to a close. We have some amazing some amazing guests with us today. We have some amazing co-hosts. So we have Dr. Alfredo Carlos, who's going to be the executive director of the Foundation for Economic Democracy. And we also have Dorothy Mulkey, who successfully brought her case to the Supreme Court challenging housing discrimination in Orange County and won. So what we're going to kind of do today is I'm going to go ahead and let all of the co-hosts introduce themselves. We're going to watch a short video that gives us a quick synopsis of redlining and its dark history. And then we're going to jump into our Q&A with our amazing panelists today. So I will go ahead and let Janet Foster of YIMBY Long Beach introduce herself.
Hi everyone, I'm Janet Foster and I'm a member of the Long Beach YIMBY chapter. And here in Long Beach, we're involved with a lot of advocacy work here in the city, attending city council meetings and advocating for affordable and fair access to housing here. And it's great to be here. And I'm recently elected to the Los Angeles County Democratic Central Committee for District 70, which includes Long Beach. So it's great to be here. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Jan. I'm glad you're joining us. We also have Lisa Pedersen for White People Against White Supremacy.
Hi, good evening, everyone. My name is Lisa Peterson, and I'm one of the co-founders, along with Kimberly Adams, with a local Orange County group called White People Against White Supremacy, also known as WPAWS. We're modeled after our national group who's called Showing Up for Racial Justice, who moves white folks to act as part of a multiracial majority for justice. At WPAWS, we work to undermine white supremacy. We believe that those who identify as white can and will benefit from understanding how racism and white supremacy keeps all people divided and how to address systemic racism. At our meetings, we learn how to unpack our whiteness and how to talk to other white folks about white privilege. In this space, folks are able to build relationships, skills, and political analysis to act for change. We meet online first Sunday of every month from 3:30 to 5 p.m. And right now we're going chapter by chapter through Robin DiAngelo's book called White Fragility. So for anyone interested in joining our group and or follow us on social media, I'll leave our information in the chat room.
I am so going to join that group. I'm sorry, that's awesome. All right, and then we also have Jessamine Gardner from the Beach Cities for Housing.
Hi everyone, I'm Jessamine. I'm the founder of Beach Cities for Housing, which is a local YIMBY group as well. So Janet, you and I are neighbors. We're in Huntington Beach, and then we serve communities all the way as far south as Laguna Beach. And we basically do very similar things. So we go to city council meetings, planning commission meetings, and other similar events and try to lobby for fair, affordable housing and better access.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Jessamine. All right. And someone who I know very personally, Ricardo Flores from LISC. Can you please introduce yourself?
Yeah, hi. Thank you for having me and thank you for inviting me and for bringing up this really important subject that has to really move the needle. I mean, we cannot continue down the path we're going. And I think that's crucial. I'm the executive director of an organization called the Local Initiative Support Corporation in San Diego. We are a national nonprofit, 40 years in existence. Been in San Diego for 27 years, the nonprofit. And what we do is we're a nonprofit bank essentially that funds affordable housing. And we are integral to the affordable housing space in that we provide the pre-development money or the money for our affordable housing developers to buy land to, in fact, start the whole process. So we are part of that ecosystem, and that's why we're so pleased to be here today, because we feel very strongly that the laws and the regulations currently in place by local governments are not only hurting us economically, but of course they've led to and continue to lead to segregation. So we're very happy to co-host this.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Ricardo. We appreciate it. And we definitely appreciate all of our co-hosts today. Thank you for getting the word out about, again, this incredibly important issue. And honestly, for a lot of people, this is an unknown history. It's something that it's out there. It's not even that hidden, but it's also something we don't know. It's not something that we're really taught about. So for those who have never heard of redlining for the first time or just becoming familiar with the issue, what we're gonna do now is we're actually gonna go ahead and turn to the film and then go into a Q&A session. So if you're new to the Zoom, you might see like on the bottom toolbar, there's a little chat area. As we're watching this video, I really encourage you that it might bring up a lot of questions for you that you'd like to have followed up on. So please use and abuse the chat window. We're here to answer questions for you. Again, we have some amazing panelists who can help us understand the issues better. So I'm gonna go ahead and share screen, and if all things go well, we should be watching a video here together. So let me go ahead. I am sharing screen, and I'm gonna go ahead and make it big for you all, and you should be hearing it now.
Decades of housing discrimination have helped create an enormous wealth gap between white and black families.
The enduring legacy of redlining, the legal government-sponsored effort to deny mortgages and home ownership opportunities to African Americans and other minorities, continues to undermine their quality of life. This violation of basic civil rights continues to negatively impact educational attainment, health outcomes, wealth accumulation, self-esteem, mortality rates, and civic engagement. Homeownership has proved to be both the doorway and gatekeeper to success and well-being in America. It is at the core of today's racial wealth gap.
There's a very powerful myth in this country, and that is that residential segregation in this country is something we call de facto segregation. Something that happened by accident. Every textbook that's used in American high schools and middle schools today lies about this history. It talks about how northern cities were de facto segregated without government involvement. They talk about how the Federal Housing Administration did a wonderful job of creating single-family homes in the suburbs for working-class families, without mentioning that the working-class families that created these homes for could only be white.
This began a history of excluding people of color from government housing programs. Intended to lower the cost of mortgages and increase home ownership. Segregated neighborhoods by race using a code system. Outlined minority neighborhoods using the color red. Intended to expand the secondary mortgage market by securitizing mortgage loans. Community boards often denied minority veterans mortgages. Many minority vets could not be buried in the same cemetery as whites. It wasn't until 1970 that lending to communities of color began to increase.
The way this manifested itself was through the drawing of maps. Different neighborhoods were underwritten as being riskier or safer, and the principal component that determined riskiness or safety from a lending standpoint was ethnic and racial composition.
It was at that point that the real estate developers began to drop strings around areas. The local banker could choose who would get mortgages where, so that we could not have gotten a loan out in the suburbs because those were whites only. The concept of a middle-class black only exists in the mind of a middle-class black. Everywhere else in the suburbs, you are that nigger family on the corner of Warren Road and Boulevard Way.
Well, the truth is that we've had in this country generations of affirmative action for whites. And the sad truth of it is that whites don't know that that's happened, or they refuse to accept it, or don't understand the history. And what that leads to is this false kind of narrative that I did it myself. You know, this Horatio Alger individual responsibility narrative.
There were many federal, state, and local policies explicitly racial, designed to create segregation in every metropolitan area in the country, and policies that were so powerful that they still determine the racial boundaries of metropolitan areas today. The Federal Housing Administration began a program to suburbanize the entire white working class population into single-family homes.
This is Levittown, Pennsylvania, a new suburban community of 60,000 people with its giant shopping center, winding lanes named for flowers and trees. It is fairly typical of communities all over America, where families are pursuing the American dream to give their children a better chance in life. Nearly all are young people. A large proportion are veterans. For many, it is the first house of their own, and it represents a major financial investment. In August 1957, Levittown, Pennsylvania attracted international attention as William Myers, Jr. and his family moved into the 3-bedroom house. They are very close to the Levittown norm, except in one respect. William Myers, Jr. and his family are Negroes in an all-white community.
If more colored are allowed to move in, Levittown is going to go downhill.
The only way that those developers could get the capital to do that was by going to the Federal Housing Administration. In order to get that approval, they had to commit never to sell a home to an African American.
Access to leverage allowed middle-class whites to build wealth.
The white families who bought those homes were able to use their wealth to send children to college, and they used it to bequeath wealth to their children, who could use it as down payments for their own homes.
Restricted covenants ensured that minorities could not buy into white neighborhoods. Properties shall continue to be occupied by the same social and racial classes.
When Karen and I purchased this home that was built in 1948, we found some documents in a closet. Neither the whole or any part of said tract shall be sold, rented, or leased to any persons or persons not of white or Caucasian race.
Created greatest growth of the middle class in the history of the world. In 1940, 42% of white families owned their own home. In 2000, 71% of white families owned their own home.
So consequently, that those 71%, 72% of white homeowners who own their own home should be thankful to the federal government for providing them this opportunity. What did not happen, or what happened at the same time, was that we, people of color, were discriminated against and were prevented from taking advantage of those opportunities.
The recent housing and foreclosure crisis were a continuation of a form of redlining. Financial institutions practiced unrealistic credit scoring and predatory lending. Subprime mortgages grew nearly 250%. In 1998, subprime mortgages made up 9.8% of the mortgage market. By 2006, they made up 23.5% of the market.
And the gap between white homeownership rates and black homeownership rates is 30 percentage points larger than it was back in 1968. In 1968, the typical black family had 1/6 as much wealth as the typical white family. Now it is 1/10. We have gone backwards since the civil rights era.
Latinos lost close to $170 billion worth of equity that they had accumulated in the home that they purchased many, many years before then.
When they come to access products, the choices that they're given are limited. So you're given, instead of conventional loan, you're given a special loans that have higher interest rates or higher fees that again set you up for foreclosure or failure as well.
The biggest scandal of your tenure is your unwillingness to do your job and enforce the laws that reduce housing discrimination.
The housing crisis affected all communities, but disproportionately devastated minority families. Black and Hispanic families lost nearly 20 years of wealth between 2007 and 2013. Minority home ownership is the lowest it's been since 1996.
Redlining discrimination in the Asian American community is live and kicking. And in California, you'll see that Asians had the second highest probability of going to foreclosure, very comparable to Latinos. So Latinos were 1.4, for Asians it was 1.3. And so whether it is in homeownership, rental, small business, foreclosure, across the board, there is redlining.
Between 1934 and 1962, $120 billion in FHA and VA loans were issued. Over that period of time, 98% of the loans went to white families, and less than 2% went to African Americans and other minorities. Using the average home price index between 1934 to 2018, those FHA VA loans equates to at least $3 trillion in current real estate value. Assuming that as loans were paid off and excess funds were invested in stocks and other investments, conservatively, another $2 trillion were created. This white subsidy is the major contributor to the current racial wealth gap.
So many white Americans experience this sense of self-esteem, this sense of superiority, if you will, this sense of mastery, that they have created their own destiny in their lives, and they have no acknowledgement of this invisible hand that supported them throughout their lives, and not just them, but there's a legacy of that invisible hand across generations that has translated itself from the original affirmative action to trillions of dollars of a head start ahead of other communities like African Americans, Latinos, Native Americans, others who don't have the same benefit.
Children of homeowners are more likely to graduate from high school, have less childhood behavioral problems, and achieve higher college graduation rates.
In segregated housing and in neighborhoods that are thereby segregated, that tend to be low-income neighborhoods, there is the greater likelihood that the youngsters will be involved in gangs or will be recruited to be in gangs.
I noticed an absence of hope, an absence of light. These kids were barraged with a message every single day of their lives that they weren't valued, that they didn't matter. And they internalized that. And that caused frustration and anger and eventually despair and a loss of hope.
There's now very good science that shows that this sense of not belonging, the sense of lacking self-esteem, raises cortisol levels in your blood. And cortisol is good for you when you're in an extremely stressful situation, but when you're constantly bathed in cortisol, because you're constantly feeling these stressors of being marginalized and being told that you're less worthy, less valuable, and being in constant state of really fear and anxiety, it changes your physiology completely. It makes you more prone to cardiovascular disease. It makes you more prone to diabetes. it makes changes in your brain, which actually makes it more difficult to engage in what we call executive function.
This kind of chronic stress, which is driven by the policies that we have created, is as lethal as any knife or any gun.
Suppose discrimination did end today. How many generations would it take to get to rough equality in wealth across races? Her answer is 7 generations, more than 200 years.
And so when white Americans hear about affirmative action for blacks or for Latinos, they're outraged. They think, I've done this by myself. Why can't these people? There's something wrong with these people.
The same programs that were provided to white Americans that enabled them to accumulate this wealth through home ownership, those same opportunities have to be provided to us.
Imagine where minority families would be today if their grandparents had the same access to wealth through home ownership that white families had. What would the wealth gap be between white and minority families if minorities had the same access to wealth through home ownership? Would there be a gap?
So I am going to go ahead and get my panelists back in here. Again, there's a lot to unpack in that video, especially if this is something this is an issue you're kind of starting to understand for the first time. You might actually be kind of taken aback by what you just saw. Again, this is not something that a lot of us learn about. Certainly we don't learn about it in school. So as you are coming up with those questions, please, again, put them in the Q&A. Pretty much from here on out, you as the participants and you as the viewers are going to be really driving this conversation. So if you have, I should stop sharing is what I'm being told. Great. So as you start having these questions, or as we start engaging in this conversation again, you need to be part of this discussion as well. So with that, I want to go ahead and let our panelists really introduce themselves and give some background on who they are. So Dottie, I was wondering if you wanted to go ahead and go first.
Sure, why not? My name is Dorothy Mulkey. My given name is Dorothy. I go by DJ, so I have a lot of aliases. But I am a mother, grandmother, an activist, avid volunteer, and just a plain old.
Great. All right. And Alfredo, do you want to go ahead and introduce yourself and give us some background on who you are? Oh, you are muted right now.
I always forget about that. I'm usually teaching on this thing, so I'm not on the mute. Thank you so much for hosting this panel, and I'm very honored to be serving on the panel. My name is Alfredo Carlos. I'm a professor at Cal State Long Beach in political science and Chicano Latino studies, and I'm also the executive director for the Foundation for Economic Democracy. Our organization seeks to sort of really think of different ways of developing wealth and owning land, and also workplaces collectively.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. Appreciate it, Professor. So just to kind of give a little background, in 1963, the California State Legislature passed the Rumford Act, also known as the, I'm going to put in quotes here, the Fair Housing Act, which declared that racial discrimination in housing or sales was against the law. So well-intentioned. But in response, California Association of Realtors sponsored something called Proposition 14 to overthrow the Rumford Housing Act. So I was actually wondering, Dottie, could you give us some background and how that ended up impacting you and your life, and what that legislation meant for you?
Proposition 14?
Yes, ma'am.
Yeah, what it really said in a layman's term is that a landlord had the right to rent to whomever he chose, no limitations, no restrictions. And how that impacted me? Fortunate for me, I was born a person of color, And so at the time I was born, apparently my parents didn't know that would be a problem for me in trying to rent an apartment. They went ahead and had me anyway. So when I came to Orange County, that's when the problem started, because we were right out of the military, my husband and I, and he actually graduated from high school in Riverside. His parents were divorced. Dad lived in California, mom lived in Texas. It was 1 year high school here, 1 year there. So when he graduated, he went into the service. And so when we got out of service, we came back to Santa Ana. And I was very much pregnant at the time. So living with my in-laws was a privilege. I didn't mind having people wait on me until I had my baby. And at such time as she was about 3 months old, I decided it's time to move now. We need a place of our own. So that's when the problem started. I had no idea, not having been raised in California, that it was not open to people of color for certain things. I found out immediately as we tried to rent an apartment, and even though we showed that we had the ability to pay, that was not enough. The fact that we were not the right color prevented us from renting, and that's when it all started.
And what year was that actually? Because I think a lot of people kind of confuse when some of these things happen, that they think about, oh, this happened way back in the past, but what year was this?
It was 1963.
Man, that's just like crazy recent.
57 years.
What ended up happening? You ended up taking that to court.
Yeah, it started off locally. We were denied the rental at 3 apartment buildings. We joined the NAACP, the NCLU, and so forth, so on. Anyway, they did, the Caucasian couple went in right after we did. They were, all of a sudden, the apartments were open to them. And so that began the legalities. We went to court, we went to the state Supreme Court, and it was upheld. And then this was 1964. And in the latter part of 1964, when we went to the Supreme Court, it took almost 3 years for the decision to come down, which barely passed, but a win is a win. And
yeah.
So, yeah.
That's crazy. So did you face any social ramifications as a result of your lawsuit?
Did I?
Yeah.
Yeah, you could say that. You could say that. It was, let's see, Orange County was not user-friendly for a person of color. And it hasn't changed that much in all these years. I received threats by phone. I received threats by mail. I was working at Bank of America at the time downtown Santa Ana. And the people in the bank had no idea that I was going through this civil rights thing, because I didn't talk about it. So they were just blank to the situation. But my father-in-law, Lincoln Mulkey, who worked for a reputable Orange County realtor, Dad Mulkey was the custodian of the model homes for this real estate person, who told him that he needed to, he needed to handle his daughter-in-law, otherwise his job would be in jeopardy. So when Dad Mulkey shared that with me, even though I respected him and loved him to death, I told him he might want to look for a new job because I was not backing down. So it took, as I said, almost 3 years for the court to uphold the situation. And then when we won, I was still, this time I was at United California Bank, UCB, right across the street from Bank of America. And the bank manager told me that I had an important phone call I needed to take, and it was from a lawyer from Los Angeles. And when he said, you won, you might want to come home. And when I got home, there was Channel 2, 4, 7, all the news media. I think everybody in the world was waiting at my apartment for me. and my husband. So it was just surreal, but the essence of the whole thing is we shouldn't have had to go to the Supreme Court to get rental into an apartment. That shouldn't have happened, but it did.
Were you able to move into that rental and get any sense of safety at any point?
Oh yes, at the time we were offered we went to 3 apartments. 2 of them saw after a year and a half that it didn't look good for them. And they knew that it was to their advantage to let us move in ahead of the decision. And we did. We moved into an apartment on Brook Street in Santa Ana, brand new, sawdust all over the floor. And there was no safety issues. No one really cared. The tenants could care less. No one cared except the landlord and the owner. So yeah, we moved in.
Yeah, so but they needed that peer pressure in order to allow it. So what would you say for those today that are fighting for housing equity and housing justice? What would you say for those that are fighting that fight today?
I would say be prepared, because you have to have a strong will, you have to have determination, and in my case, I needed a lot of faith.
All right. Thank you, Dottie, for sharing that. And again, if you have questions for Dottie about her experience, please put them in the Q&A. So I'm going to go ahead and kind of turn for a moment to Dr. Carlos. So could you give us a little bit more history about yourself and why you started fighting for housing and social justice issues? Could you tell us maybe a little bit more about what it was like to find secure, stable housing when you were a child versus today?
I mean, in terms of finding it, I can't really speak to that. I have to talk to my parents. But in terms of my experience growing up, I grew up in a poor immigrant neighborhood in the sort of south, the LA corridor that goes all the way from LA to the San Pedro, sort of kind of Harbor City area. Right across the street from Torrance. Police regularly, as kids, Torrance PD would always tell us to get back on our side of the street. And I grew up poor. There was about 7 or 8 of us at different times living in a 2-bedroom apartment. And this experience really kind of, impacted me in the questions that I had as we got bused to school for elementary school. I wondered why certain areas look different than others. Why did the area that I live in, was densely populated? It was mostly people of color, and it's in a maybe square 8-block area, a radius. Like majority were Latinos, and there was like a black section of it, and there was racial issues and gangs. And so I always wondered why, my neighborhood looked that way, run down, there was, like it was clear, like the owners, the managers didn't really like us. My parents were always really fearful that we didn't do anything like bad or wrong because they didn't want to get kicked out. And then we would get bused to Gardena, and sometimes we'd go into Torrance and we'd see like it's very different, starkly different. And these are some of the vestiges of the redlining, right? The history of that I learned on later on. And so, I went to college and I got really interested in some of this stuff, faced also similar housing. I saw similar housing issues in the Isla Vista community at UC Santa Barbara, and got involved in the Isla Vista Tenants Union. And so like housing for me, like the film said, is one of the indicators that really affects the rest of your life. If you have stable housing, if you have affordable housing, it allows you to live a good quality of life. And if you don't, it could actually mean like your early death. I know some folks who might be listening are probably from Long Beach. There's a couple other co-hosts from Long Beach, and in Long Beach there's an 8-year mortality rate difference between a Latino neighborhood, Latino and African American section of Long Beach, which is West Long Beach, and East Long Beach, where you have all the suburban sort of homes. And we can basically tell by our zip code, what our expected life expectancy is.
Wow. So as a professor, you're kind of in a unique position here to give us some education. So what do you wish people, besides your students, obviously, what do you wish that they knew about the effects of redlining?
So for me, there's two things, and I think the video did an excellent job of explaining a lot of the history, right? So like a lot of it is really just the blatant racism. It's just, you know, that we have to fight for just access. Like we're not asking for better treatment. We're not asking for, you know, for us to, you know, get more funding. But the other part is, you know, that makes it really clear. And I was really happy with the video that I think I'm going to use it in my classes now. That does this. It talks about like white subsidies, right? What the way I like to refer to it is that there's been a whole history in the United States of white affirmative action. Like people tend to think of affirmative action as just like benefiting people of color. Like, well, the whole history of the United States is really the reverse of that. You know, from the Homestead Act to, you know, Dr. King used to talk about in his Poor People campaign. He used to talk about, you know, county agents that, you know, were like given money from the federal government, was giving people to like teach them how to farm. The whole, you know, infrastructure of like universities to teach people how to do mass agriculture. You know, and then obviously this is one of the most recent in at least the 20th century. That redlining establishes not just racism in who can apply to these loans, but it's basically a lot of really cheap, affordable loans that, you know, that like in a period where people could afford those things, you know, a house in those times was like $40,000 in today's money. And so it just, you know, it developed this really bad system of, you know, wealth creation that privileged white folks. And so there's those two pieces, right? The political economy piece, which is like, you know, the fact that, you know, I was looking at some figures earlier that Latino average net worth in the United States is $12,000. African Americans, it's $19,000. And for white folks, it's $130,000. And you ask this question, and you know, why is that? And a lot of people use these racial sort of stereotypes. It's, oh, they're lazy. It's, you know, it's the cultural deficiency. And the reality is, no, it's actually structural. It's a political economic sort of decisions that were made in the 1930s that allowed white folks to do wealth creation, and that then allowed them to, you know, build equity and pass on, you know, through inheritances. And, you know, go to college. It funded sort of the public university infrastructure, and people can access that. And then people of color were left out of that. And so those are, I think, two of the things. I mean, I can talk forever, so I apologize if you need. If you
No, this is perfect. Yeah, no. And I think a big part of it is just getting that education. And speaking of which, we actually do have a lot of questions that are starting to come out. So I'm gonna move to Q&A because I think there's so much to unpack here, and there is so much to talk about. So I actually want to go ahead and turn to Dottie for this initial first question. So, and I will read this verbatim if I can. I don't know who asked this, but you'll know it's your question. So how do you all think the reclamation of the homes by mothers of color in Oakland and El Sereno can continue into policy change?
To be honest with you, I'm not familiar with the situation up in Oakland, but I would imagine that as with anything else, to get what you want right now, you have to go through legal channels. You have to go through organizations such as is represented here tonight. You have to go through churches. Church is a good form for getting changes done because of the strength of the congregations. You have such a mix of people, both professional and lay people, and your field of expertise may not be everything you need to get you where you need to go. So you have to surround yourself with people that know a little bit more than you do and is willing to step out and make a difference. A lot of people talk, but a lot of people don't act. And so I try even now to surround myself with people that have more action than talk.
I love it. I think that's an incredibly good recommendation to seek out that network and to find the people that can help and assist you there. I think that's really good advice. Professor, do you have anything to add on to that?
Yeah, I think that's actually a really excellent question. And for folks that don't know, the what happened up in Oakland, so these moms, were sort of squatting on some like housing they got kicked out of, and they were able to reclaim the houses in the East Bay. The reason they're actually not just able to stay there is that they were working with this organization that's a cooperative organization. It's part of a co-op movement in the Bay Area of rethinking land ownership away from just single family. And so it's called the East Bay Real Estate Company, Real Estate Cooperative, I'm sorry. And so it's basically a bunch of people who support alternative forms of home ownership and land ownership and building ownership, and they help the moms buy it out. So they help the moms buy this housing that they were squatting in. And so I think that's an excellent sort of, like Dottie was saying, is we have to act. One of the ways that we need to act is we need to, one, rethink this Levittown model of homeownership. And we have to start putting massive amounts of investments in the types of housing that can provide housing for everyone, not even just thinking of affordable housing. So I love all the work that LISC has been doing for a long time, but I think we also need to go beyond just building affordable housing. And so one of the things I'm doing is, like in Santa Barbara, I'm working with some folks who are trying to figure out how to build community land trusts, how to do democratic investment real estate, where people are pitching in to buy out private land and to take it off of the for-profit market and to turn it into just like for use housing. And so I think that's an excellent question. And I think folks need to do a little bit of research on that and like support that kind of stuff when it starts to pop up.
Yeah, and actually this really kind of goes into another question that someone had asked, and I'm going to try to do my best job to paragraph. But it does kind of speak to the fact that, a lot of Los Angeles is suburban cities, and that counts for most of San Diego as well, where we do develop kind of that lower density sprawl. And many of those low density communities are starting to see democratic changes from a majority white ownership to potentially moving toward maybe more minority ownership. So their question kind of goes along to what you were getting at, Professor, which is if we are going to address the housing shortage by building these new types of homes and new homes potentially in these previously suburban areas, how do we actually achieve that without displacing residents of color?
I think one of the ways that we can do that is, like establish like housing policies, or we do build housing, but have right of return, right? Allow the people who we're asking to move. I mean, if you know the history of sort of the Dodger Stadium, this was supposed to happen, right? We asked people to move out of their homes. Their homes got bought out, and they were going to build affordable housing, and those folks were supposed to be the first ones who got the right to come back. Obviously, that didn't happen. They built Dodger Stadium. They gave the land away, accused the land developers who were working on this of being communists during the Red Scare, and so that stopped that. That's one of the ways that we can stop that. The other way, which I'm really sort of motivated by, is these sort of democratic ownership models, like where communities come together, build a community land trust and say, hey, you know what, we're going to start buying land in our own communities and developing it ourselves. And the sort of the connect there is that, like, the problem there is, like, where do you find the capital to do that? And because there isn't like a lot of profit in that sort of investment vehicle. And so that's something that we have to figure out right now.
Great, thank you. So big question that we kind of get is, how does, sorry, we got lots of questions coming in here. I'm trying to filter for you guys. So one of the questions is, how is access to good schools affected by residential segregation today in the LA area? And I'm actually going to kind of redirect this to Dottie. When you were, looking for places to rent, how important was it, in terms of access to schools for your children? And did you find that it was, as you were looking for various apartments, like, was it easier to potentially find rental apartments in other areas where maybe the schools weren't as good, or what was the calculus like for you?
Actually, I didn't search for other schools, because at the time, this is in the early 60s, is that if you lived in Santa Ana, which is where we were, there were choices for schools, and if you didn't live within a certain radius of the school, you just used somebody else's address, which most of us did. And then they had the lottery, because at the time I adopted one of my granddaughters, and the local school to me was not appropriate for her because she had special needs. So I had to go across town to the school, which I had to enter a lobby to do it. But I told the principal on day one, whatever you decide is good, but she's going to that school. And so I don't really know if I won the lottery legally or illegally, but I know she went to that school. So it's very important to me that you get into a good school. And as a matter of fact, when we were introducing each other, I found that Carlos, my grandson, goes to UC Long Beach. He's a veteran, and he's about ready to graduate. He's doing online studies right now, but he's an advocate person. I have my youngest grandson graduated from UC Davis. The oldest one graduated from the Vanguard down in Costa Mesa. So education it's high in our family. The grandkids are showing us where to go and how to do it. But the times have changed, and now they have a support system. So housing for me was not determined by what school they were going to, because I had decided, as when we went into the California Supreme Court, that my kids were going wherever I wanted them to go, no matter what.
Great. So Professor Carlos, from kind of that experience that Dottie had, how is our current racial segregation impacting our school system, if at all? I know that the charter schools can sometimes be compounding potentially some of these racial disparities as well.
Yeah, I mean, there's a whole lot of ways. So first off, like, taxes of, the Prop 13 in California, affects local funding of schools. And that was actually a very particular policy that was passed in California as a response to racial desegregation in schools. And so what happened when schools were forced to desegregate was that wealthy white folks, what they did, and this is why to me it's important to really talk about the ideology of white supremacy, and when I say that, I don't mean like people in hoods, I don't mean like people with guns, white nationalists. I'm talking about the ingrained sort of superiority complexes where people think, I pulled myself up by my bootstraps, and like the video showed, no, it wasn't. It was actually you had access to all kinds of resources. And so there's the ideology of white supremacy that like factors into this. And people who didn't want their kids to go to school with people of color. So what they did is, there's two ways that they responded with that. One of the ways is that they built private schools. So this is when you get the growth of private schools and people pulling their kids out of public schools and putting them into private schools. The other way that they responded is they passed this local funding formula with Prop 13 that basically your land taxes.
Can I just interrupt you real quick, because not everyone knows necessarily what Prop 13 is, because we can explain that just a little bit more.
Yeah, so that's what actually I was going to do. So Prop 13 was a law that got passed in the 1970s that basically like your home ownership taxes have to be like education the way that education is funded in California has to be by local taxes. So that means if you're paying property taxes, that your taxes have to go to a local school and they can't be shared with other sort of school districts. I mean, that's the short version. There's a lot of it, but that's basically wealthy communities saying we want to keep our money in our communities, and we don't want any of our taxes to go to like communities, where school districts have more need. And so, so Prop 13 really affects the sort of long-term trajectory of our school districts. And so in terms of education, like where you live really dictates not just your health, it also dictates what kind of access in schools you have access to. One of the ways that people recently have tried to deal with this is, the people that promote charter schools, and, they say that, oh, now you can sort of get a voucher and you can go to whatever school you want to, but those schools get impacted. Also, like, people that can't afford to actually like drive their kids to those schools that are out of their communities, don't really end up going there. And that's another way that actually people are pulling their dollars out of public funding into putting in charter schools. And also a lot of charter schools actually cherry pick their students. They have sort of selection criteria. And so it's sort of, there's all kinds of these compounding racial dynamics that affect that. And then the backside of it is then when you don't have high achieving people of color, you blame it on them. We'll see, look, how come I can, if I'm a white folk, if I'm a white person, I went to UC Santa Barbara, and at the time it was 66% white students, and actually the wealthiest UC. And there was a huge gap between the kind of education that I received, even though I thought I was I did really well, and the kind of education they had. They had access to tutors, they had access to all kinds of things at the schools that they went to. I mean, I can go on for days. I teach this class like a whole semester on it.
So I'm going to actually change gears just a little bit away from education. And this one actually is a little bit of a personal question for Dottie. So why did you feel like you had to be the person to challenge Prop 14? Why did you want to push that fight so much?
Well, actually, I didn't wake up one morning and say, I want to challenge Prop 14. It just happened. The timing was right, and I was there, and why not me?
It's as simple as that. Yeah. Thank you. Yeah, I think like sometimes people look to, other people to kind of fix what's happening around them. So for you to just be like, I'm here, I'm going to do it, I think that speaks volumes. So thank you for that. So one of the questions that we're getting asked here is, where does affordable housing fit within this issue of segregation? And I'll let whoever wants to pick that up first. Let's see.
Do you want to take a stab at it, Dottie?
I'll let you can have that one.
Okay. I just want to make sure that I'm not hogging all the talking time. So affordable housing, and this is the racial piece, right? This is the continued sort of devaluing of Black folks and of Latinos. And, affordable housing, we need more of it. But historically, when people think of affordable housing, they think of housing projects that are like, like if you think of the projects, I'm pretty sure you do not think of like decent places to live. And this is because, they knew that they were building housing for people that they didn't value as full human beings. And so they built housing that was substandard, that was, and so that's why when we talk about affordable housing today, people have these really negative images of what that might look like. And so I think affordable housing is obviously something we need to continue to develop, but I think we also need to think beyond that in terms of how we conceive of like land use and housing in general. Is we need nonprofit housing. We need housing that isn't tied to sort of equity and, building maybe some wealth, but like, some people like myself, I'm a renter. I don't think in this economy in California, I am able to actually buy a house in the neighborhood that I want to live in. And so, in Long Beach, 60% of the residents are renters. And, there's people who are having like, oh, we need to convert them into homeowners. And the thing is that there's not enough single family homes for everyone. Let's assume everyone wanted to buy a single family home. There just isn't enough. So we need to look at different options of like, thinking of housing as a human right, not just as a profit-making center. And one of the things that affordable housing helps people do is it helps lower, your rent burden, which allows you to have more disposable income. Like, if I can have more disposable income, I can save, I can build wealth on my own without it being sucked out of my, my rental costs. So like, home ownership has been one of the main ways that, people have built wealth, but it's not the only way. If we can reduce the costs associated with other forms of other parts of our lives, which housing is the most expensive, then people can sort of build their wealth on their own. They can build a business. If my rent got cut in half, I could easily use that money to invest in starting a business or supporting somebody who started a business or just saving it. So I think affordable housing is definitely part of the conversation, but I think we also need to look at more democratic forms of ownership and thinking about housing not just as a for-profit center.
Great, thank you. So Dottie, our question for you, are you keeping up with kind of the laws that are on the books that are segregatory? Are you aware of any that still exist that we should be taking a look at?
Actually, I think basic rights need to be taken a look at. For example, I do a lot of shopping online, and I love Bed Bath & Beyond. Well, I loved it until recently when I made a purchase online, and I went into the store to pick up my order, and the desk for mail orders is quite busy. And so I must have been maybe number 3 in line. And when my time came, she took the other lady. And I said, "Oh, excuse me, it's my time." She said, "Oh, you can take your purchase to the cashier, she'll help you." And I said, "Well, does she handle mail orders?" She said, "Oh no, I'm sorry, I'll take you after her." I said, "Oh no. You're going to take me now." She walked up, I was already here, and it embarrassed the lady. And she said, "Oh no, you can go first." I said, "Yeah, I'm going next." And so when I told her, I said, if my order was not already prepaid, I would walk away from this because I don't like the treatment you've given me. She goes, "Oh, I'm sorry, I thought you," but she didn't think that. She didn't. It was blatant. It was just, "I'm going to take her and you're going to wait." And so this was 2019, and my lawsuit was 57 years ago. So things really haven't changed that much,
And I thank you so much for mentioning things like that. And that's why I keep coming back to sort of the ideology of white supremacy. And it's ingrained, it's ingrained in who we value and even who we think can afford what kinds of things. And so in terms of cars, in terms of, buying houses, even when people can afford them, the comment in the video that said, it didn't matter that we were middle class. Middle class to us was only like us, other people still saw us as the N-word, right? And so Dottie's experience, the fact that people still have to go through these things, in the context, and I'm sure that lady was nice, and I'm sure maybe she didn't even think about it, but that's how ingrained it is that folks don't really think about those things. And so I thank you so much for mentioning that, because it's a consistent thing, right? And then here's the adverse part of that, right? So if Dottie says something, then what she's doing is even though she's speaking up for herself, in their minds, she's reaffirming the angry African-American woman sort of stereotype, right? And so African-American women have to make they're in this no-win situation. If I say something, then I become the stereotype that, people see me as. If I don't say something, then I'm allowing somebody to to racially discriminate against me. Patricia Hill Collins has an excellent piece, where she's an author that writes about these things. It's called Mammy's Matriarchs and Other Controlling Images, which is about Black women stereotypes and how they control women and how women have to do this mental calculus every single time they go out in public. And so I appreciate Dottie that, she was like, "I'm not going to let this slide." I'm like, "No, you're going to help me next," because a lot of folks won't do that, because for them, it's they're just, it's like a no-win situation, like I said.
Yeah, so do you feel, and and I'll put this back to Dottie as well, do you feel that this history, obviously, of the Fair Housing Act, and that the fight didn't end with that the fight kept going, do you feel like if we were taught this in school, do you think people would get a better understanding of the experience of people of color and might have a different view or the way that they're treated. I mean, how would we go about potentially preventing these experiences that you've had?
I think, I mean, I'm a huge proponent of ethnic studies in high schools, to be honest with you, to talk about some of these things, particularly because of what was said in the film, that, like, you know, your sense of self is affected, and if, you know, by the time you're already in high school, you already have this vision of how the world sees you, and if it's not a positive one, what's your motivation? And so I think if people, like, you know, these classes, ethnic studies, Black studies, Chicano Latino studies were taught in schools, I think people would have not just a better understanding of themselves, like me as a Latino, if I would have known these things, but I think we have better understandings of each other. Because, like, even though a lot of these things are racial, you know, they also apply to poor white folks in a lot of cases, right? We have a racialized discourse against poor white folks that we sometimes don't acknowledge. Obviously, it's not the same. It's not the same in terms of white African Americans or Latinos. There's different scales, and I like to, when in my classes I talk about magnitudes. But I think helping understand, like, other people's shoes earlier on, and actually, instead of brushing it under the rug, like, helps people build solidarity. And honestly, I think that's what we need. I think people don't know how other people live. Like, that's why I'm not ever ashamed to talk about growing up poor, but a lot of people don't like talking about that. You know, growing up, you know, I remember back in the day, people, you know, would say, you know, like, I get asked the question, are you middle class? And I would say, yes. Looking back on it, like, I was nowhere near middle class. And I think that part of that is because we don't have a good understanding of how a majority of the people in the society actually live. Like 50% of the United States right now in COVID-19, you know, are living near the poverty line because of what's going on. And so, yes, I think, you know, we need to have more education on that. I think, you know, Dottie's experience, you know, the fact that it was in Orange County, local knowledge is really important. Like, Dottie, I want to have you come out to my class, or at least through Zoom, talk to my students about your experience. I think that students need to know that this didn't happen far away in the South, that this happened right here in Orange County. The same way that I talk about Mendez versus Westminster, right? What desegregated schools here in California was right next door. And so thank you so much for Dottie for being on. I know I'm hogging a lot of the time, and I apologize for that.
Not at all. But I do want to give a chance to have Dottie respond to that as well. Like, do you think education in schools would go far enough, or do we need to be doing more?
I think that if the kids were educated more of this in school, you see, I had an advantage. I didn't know at the time that I had a privileged schooling, because back in Kentucky, where I'm from, it was an all-Black school, and we received the second-rated books. In other words, when the whites no longer needed them, they would get the new textbooks, and they would send their old textbooks to the Black school, which we got. But our advantage was we had Black teachers, and because the town was so small, the class size was maybe, the highest number in the class was 15. It ranged anywhere from 6 to 15 students. So we really had individualized teaching that was privileged, because I didn't know at the time that was a luxury. It was like having a tutor during the school day. Whereas the teacher was not only the teacher, but on Sunday, she was my Sunday school teacher also. So I saw the same people Monday through Friday, and then on Sunday. And so if you didn't know your ABCs, you had private sit in the corner and study until you get it right type. And these people actually cared. I remember my fifth grade teacher told me, she said, you know, I really appreciate what you're doing, but you're working below where you should be. And I had a B average. She said, you're not working. You can get a B without studying. If you study, you can get an A. And I remember that years ago. And she showed me some shortcuts to how to study for this and how to study for that. It was like a private tutor because she cared. And that little lady was probably the reason that told me, you have to think for yourself. It's okay to go along with the other kids, but you be the ringleader. You tell people what to do. And I remember that. And when I went into the military, it helped me. When I came out of the military, it helped me. And even now, as an activist, it helps me because people know that when you're passionate about whatever it is you're doing, but if you're educated in school, you're building memories, you're building lifetime memories for that child. But also you have to take that home. And if the parents are not telling the kids that it's wrong to tell someone this, or it's wrong to discriminate because they're not like you, then who are you going to believe, the teacher or the parent? So I think it should probably be a partnership between mommy and the teacher that determines what little Johnny's going to think, because he's listening to one of you, but he can't listen to both of you.
So a lot of personal responsibility in the way we raise our kids too. But I mean, you mentioned also that you had a lot of African American teachers. I mean, do you feel that are we not learning about the history of people of color and of redlining and the struggle that's continued to go on? Is that partially because we don't have as much representation of people of color that are teaching currently or that are making decisions about this type of curriculum?
My kids, my youngest daughter is 42 years old, so and my oldest is 56, so they went to school a long time ago. And at the time my kids were in school, they had some Black teachers, but they had mostly non-Black teachers that would give them instructions, but they didn't really care one way or the other because they had to handle numbers. And when you've got 35 kids that you're counseling, how can you give preference to one? So I can't really say that my kids during the high school years had the best education from the school, but they had me nagging. So that helped a little bit, and especially with the grandkids, but because by then my girls had said, I'm never going to do to my kids what you've done to me. But they didn't realize that the pattern was set. And that's why we've got 3 out of 6 grandkids that have finished college and 2 ready to go. So.
Right. So I'm going to switch gears a little bit away from education and kind of steer it toward housing. We have quite a few questions here. Do you think it's possible that redevelopment law can be used to secure more housing for poor and middle class?
I would like to hope that's true.
I really hope that's true too. And I wish I had a little bit more of an insight into what they meant by redevelopment law specifically. I don't know, Professor, if you'd like to speak to that at all.
So I'm not a legal expert, but in terms of like policy, I think definitely, like we saw with the New Deal, like housing policy, how it affected, generations of like wealth and people of color and sort of segregation. So I think redevelopment law, and as well as any other kind of housing laws, are massively important. Like we need to use what mechanisms are available, which this means we need to, we need people in the planning departments of cities to like really think about these things in a sort of in a critical way. And so, I mean, going back to education, that means we need more, planners of color. We need obviously more teachers of color, so that we can, and also to think differently. So like, I think one of the things that I think is important to me is for us, as an educator, one of the things that I try to do is, I want to teach people about this history, right? I want to teach people about how history has impacted us, how it led us to this moment. But really what I'm really interested in is like, let's think beyond the sort of, to use a cliche, outside of the box. Let's really think about other ways of conceiving how we live. And that means really challenging the concept of the American dream. To me, to be honest with you, the American dream was conceived of in the 1950s. This is the Levittown sort of American dream, white picket fence house that was only accessible to white folks and or middle class folks. And so like that vision isn't attainable for a lot of people. And one, we have to question whether it's actually something that is that is like that people should attain? That, you know, do we really want that? Is there other ways that we can live great qualities of life, just more in community, more democratically? And so, like, when we talk about housing, it's not just using the current laws that are there, but it's also changing laws. Like, how do we, you know, like, for instance, the city of New York and the city of Berkeley and the city of Wisconsin have dedicated money specifically for the development of worker-owned businesses. Well, we should use some of those same resources to, like, develop, you know, community land trusts, to invest in affordable housing. The city of Ventura, I think, I was on a call yesterday, is actually doing really awesome stuff around, like, you know, putting their funds. I think Carson actually also too is developing a lot of housing to meet the need of the community using city dollars. So yeah, it's redevelopment policy for sure, but also how can we pass other laws that expand public investment in housing?
Yeah, can you just elaborate real quick? I think you just inserted in like a really interesting topic there, which is, can you explain community land trust a little bit?
Yeah, so a community land trust is basically a legal entity that brings together different stakeholders. You know, it could be residents, it could be the city government that they're putting money in. It can be, you know, anybody who's impacted by the concept of housing that wants to be part of this private entity. These people get together, they establish a democratic sort of version of, like, you know, who's going to represent the board, you know, who's going to be on the board, and it's going to be representative of all these different stakeholders. And they fundraise a ton of money to buy out land and take it off of for the for-profit market and to do something with it. Usually it's parks, private parks that are open to anyone. But a lot of people have been actually doing this to build housing. The first community land trust was actually some African-American farmers in the South who got tired of sharecropping because they weren't going anywhere. They fundraised a lot of money to buy out their own land so that they can be their own farmers. So it really comes out of the history of self-help and African Americans really trying to help themselves. They encountered a huge racist infrastructure where, like, you know, they wouldn't get loans for farming, they wouldn't get loans to, like, you know, because of the racism. There's an excellent documentary on it called Arc of Justice. It's like a 20-minute video, but it shows, like, their struggle to, like, not just have a collectively owned farm as a community, but also they were trying to build housing on it also. And so community land trusts have been used since then to try to really deal with how do we own land as a community, you know, collectively, you know, as a group of people who, and to do it in a democratic way.
So this one is definitely going to be a Dottie question. So Carlos, because you mentioned like a lot of these policies, it seems like it almost seems like we kind of know what we need to do, but it's not happening. So Dottie, you held people accountable. You held politicians accountable. How do we do that today?
Well, it's really a kind of difficult because, as I said before, a lot of people want to do a lot of things, but they're not willing to do it, but they're willing to help you. I do a lot of volunteer work for charities, and I noticed that some of our really large projects, everyone is so willing to help, but no one wants to lead. And I get it all the time. Well, if you can just be in charge of this, I'll help you. But they want the candy, but they don't want to bake it in the oven. They want me to make it, and then they will help me eat it. And so I think that until you decide that if it's going to be, it's up to me type thing, that we will get a lot accomplished. And all you have to do is think out of the box. If you're doing something that makes you uncomfortable, you're doing it right. If you're doing it and it's comfortable, something's wrong.
I love that. Thank you so much. I want to kind of, we have a few questions that kind of get into some like nerdy urban planning stuff. So we've gotten to that point of the questions. Congratulations, everyone. You're doing a great job. But we do have an interesting question here, which is, I just read Death and Life of the Great American Cities by Jane Jacobs. Just to give everyone an understanding of what this is, Jane Jacobs was an advocate within New York, and this was during a time when they were starting to build freeways within New York. And so she was an advocate who was trying to, in her eyes, save her neighborhood. And she wrote this long book. It is not short or concise, but she does talk about basically how neighborhoods really bring people together. There's eyes on the street, and basically there's a value of that neighborhood networking, kind of like Dottie that you were referring to, is finding your community and your people that you can network with. But the question was, is she still influential among urban and affordable housing advocates? Does her philosophy still apply to today, or does it not? So I don't know if either of you are very familiar with that book.
Like I said, I'm not a planner. Maybe this is something that the YIMBY folks can kind of chime in on.
Oh man, am I gonna have to answer that question? I will gratefully say that she is still influential. I think where the challenge of Jane Jacobs' philosophy is that I think when it was her community that was facing this type of aggression, she basically founded the concept of community planning groups. And so when it was against fighting freeways, that was a great thing. She was protecting our neighborhood. But I think where her philosophy, where people are starting to struggle with it in today, and is the big question that we have about her legacy, is that now people are using Jane Jacobs to fight affordable housing. They're using it to fight infill housing, and they're using it to, and community planning groups. I know LA has them, and I know certainly San Diego has them. They are often used as and listed as one of the biggest issues we have to pushing housing forward. And so it's a really complex legacy that she has, but certainly she's still part of the discussion. Professor, looks like you have a
So we're talking about freeways. We live in LA, or Southern California in general. So I haven't read this book, but in terms of, I think people who help us rethink how we use space are really important. My concern is really like which ones of those planning groups get listened to. So my example here is the 710, right? If you take the 710 northward, it says the whole way you're driving north, it says Pasadena, it says Pasadena, it says Pasadena, and it never actually gets to Pasadena because there was a community of wealthy white folks who fought the freeway there, and they were successful, and that's great. But when people of color, people of color don't have as much time to invest in actually going to these meetings because they work 40 hours a week, if not more. There's sort of, like working class fatigue that sort of work that happens. And so, and I'm not saying that I'm not saying that as a cop out for people not to get involved, but even when people of color do get involved, they don't get listened to in City Hall. And so, there was people who fought, in LA to not have the 110 split the African-American community, and it still got built. And so I think we have to deal with sort of the racial vestiges of like, who gets listened to more, which, in Long Beach, for instance, recently, we were going to relook at the land use policy, right, to change the density. And the East Long Beach, a couple of people got together and like raised hell, and then we changed. We didn't even address it. We didn't even start talking about that. People of color in Long Beach have been organizing around environmental racism and the fact that the incinerator over there is negatively affecting asthma clusters in that region, and nothing ever happens. So I think, the in terms of like talking about land use and, the legacy of, I don't know this particular author, but I think we do have to think about how we use land and space, but also the racial sort of dynamics of who gets listened to in those conversations. Are we doing enough to not just, have workshops in those communities, but actually take into account how these decisions are going to impact people's lives? And so when we talk about freeways, they mostly negatively impact people of color. And that's why they were built where they were built.
So I'm going to give this next question to Dottie first. As we're starting to kind of reach the top of the hour here. How can we talk about housing discrimination and how it hurts all of us? in a way that, you know, people who might not be the most equity minded. And I think that's kind of across the board. I know white people for white supremacy was, you know, talking about earlier, like sometimes progressives, you know, aren't doing the greatest job here, right? You know, where they think they might be equity or equality minded, but maybe as we really talk about the issues, they're not. So how do we talk about this issue of housing discrimination in a way that people can really find it compelling and that they can understand it and really get behind it?
Tough question. I'm not really sure that in 2020 that I'm able to address this as I was back in 1963. But I do know for a fact that there are a lot of laws in motion, and there are organizations. For example, one of the organizations where a lot of the people that I go to church with belong is called the Homeless Coalition. And they're about maybe 25, 30 years old. And it was a group of people that decided they needed to form a corporation for affordable housing for people of color. And they started off really small with about maybe 5, 6 members. Now it's maybe 20, 25, but that organization has people that are professional people, some lay people, some working, some retired, but together they're getting a lot of things done, and it's grown now into more than Homeless Coalition. As far as housing, now it's like a community help group. In other words, if someone can't pay the mortgage, or if they're, you know, little Johnny needs a pair of shoes, so they're branching out. But you have to form an organization. You can't do certain things alone. You can be an advocate, but to get things done, you have to have a co-op. You have to have other people that are trying to do what you want done, and together you can make a difference.
Great, awesome. I'm gonna throw the same exact question to Professor Carlos.
Can you repeat the question? I'm sorry.
Sure, yeah, which is,
I'm still thinking about all the things that we've been talking about, and
I know there's so much that we talked about. I mean, I think that's the thing that I think is the big takeaway for everyone here that's listening tonight, is there is so much to learn about this topic. Like, you can jump around everywhere, which I just think goes to show like how insidious this issue has been over time, and that we really need to reflect and look at it. But anyway, so the question was, how do we talk about housing discrimination in such a way that people who might not be the most you know, who might not be as equality minded might understand and find compelling? So how can we talk about this in a broader context?
I think one of the ways is really dealing with this sort of legacy of like wealth building. You know, if people understand that, you know, this is how, you know, this is why we end up with the figures that I quoted earlier, like, you know, 130,000 average white wealth versus, you know, African-American 19 versus, and it's actually lower when you talk about savings, right? You know, and even the fact that, like, you know, like housing equity in Compton, for instance, you know, it was one of the places that African-Americans were actually allowed to buy housing. Has negatively, and that was great for them. But one of the things that happened was that they took that wealth that in the 1990s, they were able to finally sell their homes and, you know, go live better lives in Riverside. But it also changes the cultural dynamics of the city. So you have the same thing that occurred with white flight in the 1950s in Compton. You had black flight in the context of, and I'm not blaming them at all, because this is the first time, one of the first examples that African Americans are finally able to actually cash in on their equity. But it also changes the cultural dynamics of a city that has historically been like a center of, you know, LA Black struggle. You know, it's where, you know, hip hop, West Coast hip hop was born. And so when we talk about housing equity, it affects, like, you know, the cultural relations. You know, it's one of the things that I think, you know, when, and this is as a Latino, you know, I get really frustrated that people love our food. They love like celebrating Cinco de Mayo, but they don't like us as people. And I think one of the reasons that is because we don't have, you know, housing equity. I live in a neighborhood that, I'm one of the few Latinos in this neighborhood, and people look at me weird because they probably have not interacted with a lot of people like me who are professionals. And so it's one of these things that I think enhances, like just cultural like norms. Growing up in the United States, but also like moving back and forth between Mexico, because I was born in Mexico, is really weird because in Mexico, everybody knows their neighbor. And here, it's not like that. And I think a lot of that has to do with racial fear. But I think housing equity, like one, affects not just like all these things that I'm sort of talking about, but for people that just are interested from a sort of basic perspective, I think our lives are enhanced when we get to know people from other cultures and other backgrounds and other histories. And I don't just mean racial, I also mean ethnic and regional. Like, Dottie, she came from, she said, what state did you come from?
Kentucky.
She came from Kentucky, if she was my neighbor, I got to talk to her, we learn each other's stories, and we come from different parts of the world. And I think those kinds of things, when people allow themselves to like get to know that, enhances a community and builds stronger roots, community-based, that allow communities to kind of like, weather crises, right? We're more willing to work with other people when we know them. And I think when we know people who don't look like us, I think that strengthens it even more.
That's great. All right, so this is my final like rapid fire question to both of you. Okay, so I'm going to start with Dottie. So one, I think you mentioned earlier that you're a little bit of a historian. So one, what did we miss tonight that we need to know? And two, if we wanted to learn more, what should we do?
Well, I think you probably asked me everything from A to X, but if you want to go to Z, just go to Google.
Yeah. You know what? I love that, because I think, Dottie, you've been talking about like actually taking action all night. That's what everyone needs to do. Your first step is to go to Google and to learn about it. That's your action item today. All right, Professor Carlos, same rapid response question to you.
I agree with Dottie. I think, look for what people are doing in your neighborhood, in your community, right? So look at what, there's always somebody doing something, and how can you support what's already being done? And if nobody is doing it, then reach out to people who are doing it somewhere else to help you get it started. In terms of where people can go to, the book, the book that the documentary is based on, I think, because they interviewed Richard Rothstein, is called The Color of Law. He has actually really excellent books on education, even like the opportunity gap, right? If you want to learn about the history of LA, you read The City of Quartz. It talks about a lot of this sort of racial segregation history. In terms of a couple of things that I have a YouTube page, and if you all send out an email or something, I can give it to y'all, where I have a bunch of playlists on racial justice, on all kinds of different things that I use for my teaching. One of the playlists is on gentrification and housing. That's a quick one. That's,
Love that. Awesome. Well, I'm going to go ahead and I am going to turn this over to California YIMBY. Speaking of a group that is doing things, that is hosting these types of events, I know that this is part of this larger equity series that they have been having, great educational webinars. It's an organization that is fighting for these exact types of things. I'm going to hand it over to them and let them give the final closing remarks. I am done today. Thank you guys so much to our panelists. Please, round of applause in your apartment and make your roommates uncomfortable. Thank you guys so much.
Thank you all for attending. This has been recorded live and we'll be sending an email out. Thank you again to all the panelists, and we hope you have a really great rest of your evening.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, Marissa. Thank you all so much.
Thank you for having me.
And thank you, Marissa, for moderating. You did a wonderful job. We really appreciate you. And if anyone is interested in finding out about California YIMBY and what we do, you can visit caymby.org, cayimby.org. Thank you and have a wonderful evening.